If I haven't met you before, my name is Luke, and I'm part of the team here at HopeUC. Who was here last Sunday? Great, a bunch of you were here. We had Pastor Austin preach, and we are in our season of Jesus Is. We've been on this theme for maybe like last 12 weeks. But last week and this week, we've kind of just jumped into a little cul-de-sac on this theme, and we're spending 2 weeks talking about the miracle-working Jesus, right? Jesus is a miracle worker. And so I'm really excited. I hit up Austin a few weeks ago and was like, all right, we've got to do this together. You do week 1, I'm part 2. Let's make sure we're like interacting. And as we were chatting, he tried to steal all of my miracles. Like, well, not mine, but did you get it? Like this week's miracles. And I'm like, buddy, just stay in your lane. But last week, he did touch on the first 4 of 7 miracles that we read in the book of John. All right, so he spoke to the water being turned into wine, the official son who was healed at a distance, the paralytic man healed on a Sabbath, and Jesus feeding the 5,000. And what we see in those 4 initial miracles, and what I want to build upon today, is Jesus demonstrating his power and authority over different circumstances and situations. So he begins by demonstrating that he has power and authority over substance and matter. So he had water, he turned it into wine. He's the God who created water and grapes and all of this in the first place, but he can also change one thing into something else. Like, I don't know, anyone else done anything like that recently? But Jesus is demonstrating, I have power and authority over physical matter. Then this official comes up to him and asks, please heal my son. Where's his son? At home, at least a day's walk away. And Jesus says, go in faith, your son is healed. The guy gets home and finds out that at the exact time that Jesus pronounced those words of healing, the kid was healed. And so Jesus demonstrates his power and authority not only over matter and substance, but across time and space. He doesn't need to even physically be in the room with this kid for the kid to be healed. And so I'm saying to you this morning, if you're believing for a miracle, right? I mean, God's present, he's omnipresent, so he's actually everywhere. But receive your healing this morning. The paralytic man, he gets healed, stirs up a little bit of a drama because Jesus healed on the Sabbath. There were 6 days in which Jesus could heal apparently, but not on the 7th. You know, he should have been resting. And Jesus actually demonstrates, hey, I am the God of the law. And he wasn't breaking the law in this instance, but he's demonstrating over your religious limitations that you would put upon me, I'm actually going to break those off you. And then finally, with the feeding of the 5,000, he demonstrates that he has power and authority to multiply. So thank you, Jesus. Today, we're going to speak to the final 3 miracles that are talked about in the book of John: walking on the water, healing a blind man, and raising Lazarus from the dead. So you ready for that this morning? Come on. Now, I really need you, can you encourage me this morning? Because every time I preach this in my head, I've preached it like I'm ready for revival, and I'm not saying that because I don't want the glory, but just the encouragement will help. Thanks. Now, in the book of John, we're going to before we go to the miracles, I want to spend some time talking about John, like the Gospel of John, what's going on here. There are 7 miracles that are spoken of, and there are actually married in a few instances to those 7 miracles. There are 7 instances where Jesus says these words, I am. Now, hopefully for some of you here, you go, wow, I've heard that before. I get what that is. Certainly for Jewish people, if you mention the words I am, you are making a statement about Yahweh, God, right? Back from in the Old Testament, when God introduces himself to Moses, he introduces himself as Yahweh, the great I am. This was a name for God that was so powerful, they wouldn't even utter it. When they spelt it, they would take the vowels out of the name. That's how honorable and holy this name was. So for Jesus in a room with a bunch of religious leaders to make the bold statement, I am, well, that's a big statement. And John deliberately keeps those moments and those statements in his letter that he is writing in the gospel. And some of those actually relate to what we talk about. So when he feeds the 5,000, Jesus says, I am the bread of life. When he heals the blind man, he says, I am the light of the world. When he raises Lazarus from the dead, he says, I am the resurrection and the life. And you can read across the book of John, there are these I am statements. John is unmistakably saying that Jesus is God. Right? The authority and the story we have seen of God interacting with his people across the Old Testament now has been revealed in the Son, Jesus, and everything that we have expected of God in the past, we now receive in Jesus today. Is that exciting? All right? This is direct and unmistakable. Jesus is now in history displaying the power of God at work amongst us. Hallelujah. Now, the other thing that's really nice of John is he actually, at the end of his gospel, he tells us why he wrote it. Did you know that? So he's got this beautiful book, 20 chapters. Right at the end, he says this: the disciples saw Jesus do many other miraculous signs in addition to the ones that I have recorded in this book. So he's gone, I could have picked from a plethora of miracles, but I chose these specific 7 because I want to do something. This is what he wants to do. These are written so that you may continue to believe. I picked 7. This is John, not me. I picked 7 miracles and I put them in order in like a crescendo. I couldn't think of that word in the first service. Someone came up and reminded me, but in a crescendo, finishing with Lazarus. That's why Austin wanted to preach on it. Finishing with Lazarus, right? Lazarus, and crescendoing with victory over death. I did this so that you may continue to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing in him, you will have life by the power of his name. Did you know that miracles are the gift of life in you and I, in our lives, right? By believing that we would have life in the power of his name. So, John's got a purpose. He's got a reason for why he writes what he writes. He's got a reason that he picked 7 specific miracles in crescendoing order. And he's not going backwards. Now, when he says that you would believe, there are 2 ways this word is written. It's written so that for those who do not believe, they would read his gospel and come to believe. But it's also for those who do believe that you would continue to believe. And John's book, his letter, it's written actually quite late in that first century. The synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, they are similar gospels. There's a lot of similar stories in those 3 books. John, 90% of it is brand new, like it's not heard of in those previous gospels. And those 3 were written quite earlier on in the first century, closer to when Jesus walked and talked and performed these miracles. John's now writing at a later date, towards the end of the century, to a different group of people, right? A group of people, a next generation growing up who weren't physically present when Jesus did some of these things. And he's trying to write with a very intentional purpose to say, you can trust these stories. You can trust what you hear about Jesus. He is the miracle worker, and he will continue now in your life to perform miracles. When I was doing my research, I found this really cool little passage. Let me read it out to you. It says, John has provided us the best evidence he can muster to persuade us that belief is not only a reasonable choice, but a necessary decision if we're going to follow Jesus. Jesus is a person. He is God incarnate in human history, and in coming into history, he has left marks that we can see, measure, and trust. That's what John is doing. He wants to stir up, and this morning I want to join John in stirring up your faith to believe that you may have life, the gift of miracles in your world. Miracles will become normal, right? Normal activities in your life. Now, the other thing that he does, which I think is really brilliant, is he sets up his book, letter, like Jesus is constantly on trial. Obviously, at the end, he is on trial before the Sanhedrin, and he does get charged and put on the cross. But the entire book is kind of set up like Jesus is on trial. And he's not only on trial in that current circumstance, because you watch the crowds divide. Everywhere Jesus goes, there's a crowd following him, and every time he speaks, the crowd divides. You have the believers and those who are non-believers. There's not a third option for people sitting on the fence. It's either belief or non-belief. And John knows that not only in his day, but for every person that reads this gospel and for every generation that follows, you and I, Jesus will continue to be on trial as we weigh up and decide, will we believe or will we not believe? And so this morning, for some of you, you may not consider yourself a Christian. You may not consider yourself in relationship with Jesus. And Jesus is on trial for you today. I hope that I can stir up your faith, that you would soften your heart and say, you know what? He is who he says he is. He is the miracle working God. Some people found Jesus' personal claims so outrageous that they were filled with rage and they worked to sabotage him. We're going to see a lot of that today. Others observed his deeds, listened to his words, and decided to believe that he indeed was God's messenger, his son, bearing divine truth for the world. So while Jesus is on trial in all of our lives, even those who believe, where will you find yourself in the parting crowd? Where will you find yourself this morning? Some of you, it's an easy pick, and that's great. But some of you, even though you have believed, I sense sometimes in the Christian faith and even in my own life, it's like we numb down our sense of expectation because we're a bit nervous, like to make these outrageous claims about Jesus. Because, I found myself sometimes going, I'd believe him even if he didn't do a miracle. Not because I have faith in the midst of trouble, but actually because I'm actually believing less of him, right? And I want to encourage you this morning, join the crowd on the believing side. Amen. So, let's look at our first sign. Are you ready? Walking on the water. We are in John chapter 6, 16 to 21. That evening, Jesus' disciples went down to the shore to wait for him, but as darkness fell and Jesus still hadn't come back, they got into the boat and headed across the lake towards Capernaum. Soon, a gale swept down upon them and the sea grew very rough. They had rowed 3 or 4 miles when suddenly they saw Jesus walking on the water towards the boat, and they were terrified. But he called out to them, "Don't be afraid, I am here." Then they were eager to let him into the boat, and immediately they arrived at their destination. So here's our 5th miracle in the long line of 7 that are coming. 5th miracle, Jesus walks on water. John, the author, is intentionally including this miracle story because he wants to demonstrate, and I've said this earlier, that Jesus is exactly like the God of the Old Testament. Jesus has the same power over creation that we see ascribed to God previously. Not only does Jesus have the powers of Yahweh, he is also seen fulfilling the roles of Yahweh. Roles such as feeding, protecting, rescuing, guiding his people. This is what we see of Yahweh in the Old Testament, and we now see of Jesus in the New. Now, Psalm 77, 16, 19, and 20 says this. Bear in mind, this is about Yahweh in the Old Testament, right? Listen to these connections. The waters saw you, O God. The waters saw you and writhed. Your path led through the sea, your way through the mighty waters, though your footprints were not seen. You led your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron. So John includes this walking on the water story because he's saying to future believers and current church people and to us today, hey, Yahweh did this in the past. It's documented. There's the stories we talk about. He walked on, he split the sea. He led his people through. And here, Jesus is demonstrating the power and authority over creation, just like God. Our God has authority and power over creation. There's also another Old Testament connection that is here. It's subtle, but it's definitely here. In the Old Testament, there was a strong connection between waters and chaos. So you see in the creation story, it says his spirit hovered over the waters. That's his spirit hovered over chaos, and he brought order. Then you see when the Israelites walked through the Red Sea, the fact that God can command chaos to split in half and they can walk through on dry ground. You've got waters in the flood story. Right at the end in Genesis, it says that around his throne, the waters are as crystal as glass, meaning there no more chaos, no more chaos. And here in this story, in the midst of the disciples' fear and chaos, Jesus comes walking. He's not fearful. He's not scared. He is in control of creation, and he walks on. I was going to say walks on by them, but he walks towards them. This miracle reveals the truth of Jesus' presence in our storms. He is the great I am in the midst of chaos. And you can see the disciples were very eager to get him in the boat. And my encouragement to you this morning is in the midst of your storm, you have got to continue to invite Jesus into your boat. You have got to continue to invite him in the midst of your storm. Come on, Jesus, we need your presence today. We need the peace that your presence brings in our situation. And so this morning, for some of you, you're going through trials and tribulations, and we are going to pray for the presence of Jesus, his peace in your circumstance, and that his presence would bring a cessation to the storm. I hope that's a word that I didn't just make up. So, if that's not enough, hopefully already some of you are getting a bit excited about our miracle working God, right? But that's just miracle number 5. Let's move to miracle number 6, healing the blind. This is Jesus with a demonstration of power over our physical bodies. John 9, 1-7. As Jesus was walking along, he saw a man who had been blind from birth. Rabbi, his disciples asked, why was this man born blind? Was it because of his own sin or his parents' sin? It was not because of his sins or his parents' sin, Jesus answered. This happened so that the power of God could be seen in him. We must quickly carry out the tasks assigned to us by the one who sent us. The night is coming and then no one can work. But while I am here in the world, I am the light of the world. Then he spit on the ground, made some mud with the saliva, and spread the mud over the man's eyes. He told him, go wash yourself in the pool of Siloam. So the man went, washed, and came back seeing. Now, this pool was a pool that was attributed that it had power, that an angel would stir the pool and people would jump in and get healed. Jesus sends him not to go get healed, but sends him because I have already healed you, right, with the saliva mud concoction. Now go wash yourself and be free. So this is Jesus saying, like, you don't need a pool and water, you don't need tradition and history, and whilst all those things might be helpful and good, I am the light of the world in your midst, and you are healed. Immediately following this passage, there's a lot of text in today's message, so there's parts that we'll read and parts that I'll tell you about, so I trust you will go home and do your own study. But immediately following this passage, the blind man, or I should say the healed man, goes to the temple to present himself. And he gets to the temple and he's like, hey, I have been healed. Now, the Pharisees are there, religious leaders are there, they all get a little bit upset because guess what? It happened on the Sabbath again. And of course, you should not heal people on the Sabbath. So they're getting upset about it, they're having a little argument. When it's kind of like, they're losing that argument because it's already happened and Jesus isn't at this moment in the temple, the Jewish leaders say, well, guess what? I actually think this man wasn't blind. That's what's going on. He's just telling us a story. He's concocted it. Hey, let's go get his parents. Let's find out the truth of what's going on. Silly people, because then these parents rock up and they only more publicly confirm the truth of the miracle that has happened before them. So the man has been blind since birth, and yes, his parents are there to testify. They get really upset. The blind man, now healed, up until this point, he hasn't really declared a personal faith and belief in Jesus. He's just stoked that he can see now, right? All of a sudden, he's so frustrated at his circumstance, so he stands up and then he claims that apart from God, no one can perform such a miracle. Because they're trying to say, well, if Jesus did do it, it was because he's demonic. And the guy's like, apart from God, no one can do this. And then the Jewish people, they just kick him out of the temple. They're just like, well, hang on, we silence him. Cancelled, you're out. He comes back to Jesus and he tells Jesus the story. At this point, you can see that it's just this, it's like the miracle has been performed, and bit by bit, even as he's argued and wrestled with the synagogue leaders, the temple leaders, he's like, I know, you are the Messiah. He comes to this belief, you are the Messiah. And then Jesus responds and says, I entered this world to render judgment, to give sight to the blind, and to show those who think that they see that they are blind. Boom. Now we realize the truth of actually what's going on in this circumstance. Yes, Jesus is healed and it's powerful. But he's actually revealed to us that the Pharisees and a lot of the crowd who are around are truly the blind ones, and they've missed the miracle. They're actually the blind ones. As a viewer, reading and watching this story unfold, it becomes obvious that we are being spoken to. We're being talked to through this gospel. You and I too must choose. Will we believe the evidence of the miracles at work? And we see the theme continues now to grow of this divided crowd. We have a split in the middle. No one can sit on the fence in this circumstance. We have a split in the middle. You either believe or you're blind. And the truth is, the Pharisees, the people of close religious, who should have seen, are actually the people blind to what's going on. And of course, because they are blind to what's going on, they mock and they try to confuse the situation. I wonder, have you ever found yourself being persecuted on account of your proclamation of a miracle? Something happens in your life, it's great, you testify that it is the work of Jesus in your life, and then those around you, you just had a Panadol, that's why. Oh, you just had a little nap, you rehydrated, and that's what got you through this. And people will always, right, when you are blind to faith, right, when you are blind to the truth, you will always look for a reason to ignore it or deny it. You'll reason it away with things like, yeah, it's just, it's just Panadol. You'll do anything you can to avoid the confronting truth that Jesus is God. So when you and I receive a miracle, and this morning I know there are people who have received a miracle, there are people who are waiting for a miracle. But receiving a miracle is only part of the story. God actually requires, like this blind man, that you and I would receive a miracle and then testify to it and be ready for the backlash. Be ready for the backlash. We were up in Queensland this week at a conference, and one of the pastors said this. It was so great because then I was like, typed it quickly down in my notes to share with you this morning. It's probably not a real miracle unless it is followed by some kind of mockery. Right? The minute that God turns up in your life and does something powerful, you will experience persecution and resistance. As seen by in these stories, and it's going to continue to crescendo into this next miracle, but you and I will experience that, and you've got to be ready, church. Right? If we have moved with the parting crowd, we're on the side of those who believe. We believe that Jesus is Lord, a miracle-working God, not just in the New Testament, but today. And when we testify of his goodness, we will receive resistance. We will find people mocking us for our belief. So just join the crowd, the good crowd. Sign number 7. Are you ready? Lazarus. I've mentioned this in crescendoing order. Jesus starts with this water into wine. He heals a paralytic man, the man's son. He feeds 5,000, walks on water, heals the blind man. And not only has he displayed his power and authority over creation, over matter, over time and space, over humans' physical bodies, he now demonstrates that Jesus has power and authority over death and the grave. Humanity's worst, highest, craziest foe, right? The thing that for generations and generations has hurt and hindered and stolen from people. Jesus now says, hey, come close. I'm going to demonstrate my power and authority over death. So, John chapter 11, a man named Lazarus was sick. He lived in Bethany with his sisters, Mary and Martha. We hope some of you will know this story. Verse 3, so the sisters sent message to Jesus telling him, Lord, your dear friend Lazarus is very sick. But when Jesus heard about it, he said, Lazarus' sickness will not end in death. No, it happened for the glory of God, so that the Son of God will receive glory from this. Previous miracles, it was all about the glory. Why was the blind man blind? It wasn't because of his sin, it was for the glory of God. Although Jesus loved Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, he stayed in his current location for the next 2 days. Finally, he said to his disciples, let's go back to Judea. Jumping down now to 32, he gets news. He's approached Judea, he gets news, Lazarus has died. When Mary arrived and saw Jesus, she fell at his feet and said, "Lord, if you had only been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping and saw the other people wailing with her, a deep anger welled up within him. And he was deeply troubled. "Where have you put him?" he asked. And they told him, "Lord, come and see." Then Jesus wept. The people who were standing nearby said, "See how much he loved him?" But someone said, "This man healed a blind man. Couldn't he have kept Lazarus from dying?" Jesus was still angry as he arrived at the tomb, a cave with a stone rolled across its entrance. "Roll the stone aside," Jesus told them. But Martha, the dead man's sister, protested, "Lord, he has been dead for 4 days. The smell will be terrible." Jesus responded, "Didn't I tell you that you would see God's glory if you believe?" There's John's key little phrase. They rolled the stone aside. Then Jesus looked up to heaven and said, "Father, thank you for hearing me. You always hear me, but I said it out loud for the sake of all these people standing here, so that they will believe you sent me." Jesus shouted, "Lazarus, come out!" And the dead man came out, his hands and feet still bound in grave clothes, his face wrapped in a headcloth. And Jesus told them, "Unwrap him and let him go." Whew! Miracle 1, miracle 2, miracle 3, miracle 4, miracle 5, miracle 6. We're all crescendoing to this moment where Jesus says, 7 in the Bible means completion. And we get to miracle number 7, and Jesus says, "I have authority over all these things you've been seeing me display." And it doesn't stop there. "I have all authority over death and the grave, the thing that is humanity's ultimate foe. I have authority over it." It is no accident that John culminates his 7 in this moment. This is not just about Lazarus, real life and real death. This story is told, so I hope you picked up some things in there. You're like, this sounds so much like Jesus' story. This is also about Jesus' coming death and resurrection, and it speaks to yours and my death and ultimate resurrection. A great, great miracle that we all believe and can expect. Amen? So in ever increasing measure, these miracles are being put on display today for you and I so that we would believe. I want to just take a moment before we conclude and just narrow in on something that goes on in the middle of this story that I find quite intriguing. It's said that this angered Jesus. Did anyone hear that? Did you pick up on that? You're like, hey, he's at the scene of his friend's, tomb. And Jesus knows he can raise this guy. Like, where's this anger? Where's this, and it's the anger that feeds his grief in just a moment. And we're like, whoa, what's going on here? In verse 33, the word deeply moved, right? The Greek word actually describes the snort of a horse. I'm not going to do it for you this morning. The snort of a horse in war or in a race. You've seen those footages like on TV or wherever of a horse and it kind of does that thing and then the snort that I won't do. When applied to a human, this word describes outrage, fury, and anger. So why is Jesus in this scene furious? What's going on? And there is an anger that fuels Jesus' tears in this passage, and it's fueled by a few things. He's standing in a cemetery, facing a stone in a wall that is a symbol of, again, humanity's ultimate foe, death. So he's standing in a cemetery, represent all around. Yes, but there would have been, graves all around him. That angers him. Then he's got Martha, Mary, Lazarus' family, maybe his sons, his daughters, his mother, his father, his cousins, and they are weeping and they are wailing at the loss of their family member, gone too soon. And, some cultures here today are really good at grief, and I know that Jewish tradition, they're really good at grief. And here they are weeping and wailing at the tomb of their beloved. So he's got the scene of death, he's got the grief of his friends and his family, and around it are a whole bunch of onlookers who have just come for a show. And they're going, he just healed a blind man. Why didn't he heal his friend? And this whole scene is Jesus allowing himself. He is angry at the power that sin and death have had over his beloved forever, for all of humanity. And he is furious that death and sin have stolen from this family, but he is furious at what death and sin have stolen from his people across all time. And that fury leads him to a very public display of his power and authority above the thing that is stolen from you and I for years and years and years, right? The result of sin and death together produce an outrage in the Son of God that he works to reverse its damage. Woo! Come on. I want to encourage you this morning, when we just again diving into this little angry moment of Jesus, there's an indignation that we are encouraged to feel as we look around the world and see the toll that sin and death has had on creation and humanity, right? You are encouraged through the work of Jesus right now to get righteously angry at the toll that sin has had on your life, your family's lives, your neighbor's life, so much so that you wouldn't just sit back in passivity, right? You wouldn't just go, oh, it's such a shame. Such is life. No, Jesus is saying, this is not normal. This is not right. And I'm going to step into this situation and bring resurrection life. You and I need to be fervent in our prayer and our faith today. And Austin mentioned it last week with one of the other miracles. There are some people in here who have been believing for a miracle for 38 years, like the paralytic man. Long, long time. Don't let that time suck the voice out of your life and the faith out of your life. You have got to, and example by Jesus, continue to be fervent, passionate, and active in your belief of what Jesus can do and will do in your life to the glory of God. Lazarus has become a victim of something Jesus yearns to defeat. And now you and I stand at graves hand in hand with Jesus. Right? Whatever the situation is you're believing for in your life, whatever death and sin has done to produce pain and anguish in your life, you stand at the door of that grave holding the hand of Jesus. Come on, you can approach that grave with a lot more than just a, hope you can open the grave, Jesus. Get fervent, get passionate, get public in your prayers and declaration. So we stand in the company of Jesus as we face our situations that need his miracle working power. When we face the impossible, we face death, sickness, anything that is against the will and the glory of God, it is right for us to leave behind passivity, timidity, and to take all authority of the situation in Jesus' name. And again, jumping out now, back to the crowd, be prepared. The crowd is dividing. Even today, in our nation, across the nations, we are seeing the crowd is dividing between those who will believe and those who are blind. The Jewish leaders are witnessing the situation. Lazarus has come out of his tomb, and they immediately plot to get him back in the tomb. They want to kill him. This also is the final, because it's the seventh miracle, the final one. From this moment, we transition. The second half of the book of John is all about Jesus' walk towards the cross. And so they, from this moment, it's not just we'd like to kill him, it's we are going to get this Jesus off the face of the planet. All from a dead man rising. They're so blind. They've had these miracles displayed in front of them. You imagine, they actually got to be there when Lazarus walked. They got to smell the smell. You and I hear the stories, and that's great, and we have our faith stirred by them. But man, they were witnessing it, and they were still blind. So John wants us to believe. He wants us to believe. And he's left some pretty convincing arguments for us to believe in the miracle-working power of Jesus. I hope this morning, again, I hope I've stirred your faith. I hope I've stirred your faith. Would you stand with me? I want to open up the altar. And I want to pray for three things this morning. Three things. Some of you are in the boat of chaos. You are, whether it's many years or just recently, you are facing a gravestone. you're facing a situation, however small or large it is, that you're devastated by. It's chaotic. It's alarming. It's confusing. It's concerning. You're worried about a lump. You're worried about finances. You're worried about relationships. And to that situation this morning, we are going to speak the miracle power of God. We're also going to speak the presence of Jesus in your boat. All right? So if that's you this morning, in a moment, actually just come forward, and ministry team, get ready. We're going to invite Jesus into that chaos. Second group of people, Jesus says, I am the light of the world. And we become aware that there are people who have physical sight and spiritual blindness. And I want to say to this room, there'll be some of you who need to come into relationship with Jesus, but there'll actually be some of you who are of the faith. You claim, you believe in Jesus, but there's a sense of spiritual blindness in your life because you've pulled away from believing in Jesus' full power and work. You're like, oh yeah, I could believe in him even if he didn't do anything. And again, you're making excuses for God. You're making excuses for God. So those of you this morning who actually need new sight to see his miracle working power in your life, I want to invite you forward as well. And our ministry team are going to pray for you. And finally, there's some of you in here and you've always believed. You've always had faith. You have, your little pocket rocket. And this morning, I actually want to pray to remind you the ultimate power and authority that Jesus has over death and the grave. And for those of you, I want to encourage you to let the torment that sin has had on this world, I want to encourage you to let that torment stir you up even greater. When you walk down the streets and you see people crippled by fear and shame and crippled, whether it's in a physical sense or spiritual sense, I don't want you to just be able to passively walk by them anymore. I want you to be like, in the name of Jesus, I speak healing. So I want to stir up a fire in some of you. You're already being fired up, but come on, let's let the anguish of this world, the power that sin has had, let it stir us up to greater belief that Jesus can heal. Jesus can free people, not just in the Bible, but here today. And so team, I'm going to invite you to come and pray, and ministry team, come forward. If you want prayer for anything, and I want to invite you, even if you want to just come and pray for some of these people, come forward this morning. Let's just spend some time in his presence, speaking the miracle power of Jesus over these circumstances.